bringing you a new series for the channel. We're going to start going over some DFS strategy in general. Through my experience as a YouTuber, it's become very apparent that a lot of people are looking for strategy content, specifically for DFS, on a wide range of topics. So this is going to be the first video in that series. First of all, starting with Daily Fantasy Sports 101. So we're going to assume that you have no experience in the field, completely introduce you to what Daily Fantasy Sports is, as well as some of the ways to play it, some of the strategies or terminology that you're going to hear a lot through the field to really make sure that you have a solid foundation when it comes to DFS. Obviously, videos in the future are going to get more and more complex. We're going to go into different strategies to help gain edges over your competition. This will be an ongoing series on the channel, probably going for a few years to be quite honest with you, but this marks the first episode. With all that out of the way though, let's hop into Daily Fantasy Sports 101. To begin, what is DFS? Well, DFS stands for Daily Fantasy Sports. They're fantasy contests that last for either a single day, a single game in an MLB or an NFL league, something like that, or even for a week long, like in a golf tournament sense. Either way, they are short range tournaments where you pick a lineup of usually 6 to 8 players for just that small proportion of time. So rather than a season-long fantasy league where you draft your set of players, you're making moves throughout the season, and at the end of the year your points are added up, you're dealing with prize pools for real money that are earned in much shorter time periods. So again, sometimes they last a few days, but typically they are just a few hours long. And while there's a variety of different contests, different types of formats, different websites you can play DFS contests on, the idea is that the best scoring lineup or best combination of players on any of those sites takes home the most amount of money. So there's a prize pool, obviously entry fees to enter a lineup, and the person that has the best lineup at the end wins first place. Second lineup, second place, all the way down to the last position that makes money. Different websites have different ways of splitting up the money. Some are more top heavy than others, wide variety with those as well. You may ask, what does a lineup entail? Maybe you're completely new to sports in general. Well, a daily fantasy sports lineup is a collection of players for any specific contest. Sometimes in certain sports, certain types of Draftkings contests, you have to put in certain positions. Like in football, for example, you might have to put in a quarterback, a running back, a receiver, a tight end, a kicker, defense. You may even have multiple running backs and receivers to put in as well. But overall, some players have positionality. In other sports like golf, everyone's a golfer. So you can put them in any position that they want. You just have to pick your favorite 6 golfers. The real constraint when it comes to building a lineup is their salary. So every player, depending on how good they are, how good they've been in the past, how well they project, each fantasy website will assign them a certain price. They'll also give you a salary cap, so you have to try and get the best combination of players underneath that salary cap. That's the real key to DFS. It's not always about playing the highest projected players, it's playing the players with the best points per dollar value. Another thing to mention is that there's different scoring systems for every website. Not every fancy DFS football will be the same. Some will have bonuses for over 300 yards. Some will give you 6 points for a touchdown, others 4. You'll even have points taken away for things like interceptions, fumbles, sacks, that kind of stuff on certain websites. So again, you got to pay attention to the scoring system, how many people get paid out, the weight of the people getting paid out. Let's say it's like a winner takes all type contest. There's a variety across all the different types of websites. The bigger the contest in general though, the more people in the contest, the higher the prize pools. There's some on here with less than 10 entries where the top 3 or 4 people will win some money. It's a little bit less volatile. And then there'll be contests with 100,000 to 200,000 entries with prize pools of hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, up to even 5 million for the largest of DFS contests. Essentially, the bigger contests, obviously a lot harder to win. The smaller contests are easier to take down, but there's a lot less of a reward. Some contests pay out just a few bucks to first place, some just cost a cent to enter, and then you have contests on the other end of the spectrum that are over $4,000 per entry with millions of dollars to first place. So there's really something for everybody, but on average, a DFS contest will pay out the top 18% of its participants. On some sites that's higher, they are a little bit more spread out in terms of the paying schedule, and some are even more strict, paying only the top 5 to 10%. Again, it really depends on the website and what you're looking for. My favorite sports for DFS First and foremost is golf. I also love doing DFS football. Close third being basketball. It's actually my most profitable sport. Not necessarily my favorite. I'm not a big basketball fan. Perhaps that's why I'm so good at my analysis. I don't have any bias or narratives. But at the same time, love those three sports. They also have daily fantasy sports MMA. You have it for esports, soccer, baseball, pretty much anything you can think of. You have it for Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Korean baseball. They get really creative with it. So there's a sport out there for everyone. There's a website out for everyone, a scoring system that you'll prefer, and even a correct contest. So lots of variety, and that's essentially what you're looking for in terms of DFS in general. Now let's talk about some of the specific contests that exist in terms of DFS. The #1 website in the world, the biggest provider of DFS by far, is Draftkings. They have the highest market cap, the highest amount of players, the biggest prize pools, so a lot of people tend to gravitate that way. A close #2 though is FanDuel. Pretty much like Walgreens and CVS, they both offer very similar services. They also have very similar sizes of player pools and whatnot, very similar rakes, similar payout structures, all that kind of stuff. Both of those are what I call classical DFS, where you're drafting a lineup, staying under that salary cap, and getting paid off of some type of scoring system. Now, something that's a little bit different might be something like Jock Market. So Jock Market's stock market DFS. You buy shares of players and get paid out based on how they do. The worst player gets paid out $1 in the contest. The highest played stock gets paid out $25. So there's different ways to do this. You also have prize picks where you're picking different prop bets, trying to get the best combination of prop picks to take down a contest. So depending on what you're looking for, there's a lot of variety out there. I tend to focus on Draftkings and FanDuel DFS, again, the more traditional forms, just because it's what I'm used to, it's what I grew up with. It's also what I tend to have the most success with. I also have a lot of fun with Jock Market. I like the stock market version. Being able to buy and sell stocks makes it really interesting as well. Plenty of other smaller sites that pop up here and there, but those in general are the major sites as of right now. Inside a lot of those sites, you have different types of contests as well. Not all DraftKings contests are the same, nor are all FanDuel contests. You have GPPs, or grand prize pool contests. Those are usually 100 to 200,000 entry contests that have huge prize pools in the first place. A lot more of a top-heavy payout structure, a little bit like buying a lottery ticket a little bit. So you're looking at a lot of volatility in those. And again, the guy who wins first place takes home a lot of the EV. Then you have cash games. Cash games are more where you're playing either against one single person or just trying to beat 50% of the field. This is what I think most people think of when it comes to DFS. A lot of people do play GPPs though. If you're looking for more of a consistent winning strategy, you definitely want to play cash games. Again, you only have to beat the other 50% of the competition. But just keeping this in mind, that does not mean it's easy. You still have to be consistently good. You still have to consistently out executing everyone else. So not easy by any means, but definitely the most consistent form of DFS. Then you also have double ups. Double ups, like I mentioned, part of the cash games there. That's when you're only playing and trying to beat 50% of your competition. You have 2 to 3 max entry contests where you can enter 2 to 3 entries. In GPPs, typically, it's what we call a max multi-entry contest. That's where you can enter up to 150 lineups. When you have to beat 100 to 200,000 other people, you obviously want to enter more than one lineup. So that's what it usually is with those GPP contests. And then you have single entry contests. There are some that limit you to only one entry. Those have a lot more volatility. Those are a lot more lottery tickets than anything, because obviously getting the perfect combination of 6 players with just one try is very difficult. If you're doing DFS as a hobby, just trying to have fun, I always recommend playing single entry contests. Playing in GPPs, playing in max multi-entry contests, a lot of times you're playing against professionals or people that do this full time. Those people are entering 150 lineups, using a lot of data, using optimizers and whatnot. And if you're doing this as a hobby, you probably want to stick to the single entry or cash games. Now let's talk about some DFS terminology. First, let's start with ownership. You're going to hear ownership everywhere, ownership that, this guy is high owned, this guy is low owned. At the end of the day, we're talking about the percentage of lineups in a GPP contest that are going to own a said player. Obviously, this is important to know. It's especially important when it comes to a grand prize pool contest. If a guy is super high owned and he ends up going out and busting, it's a really good idea to avoid that player. Obviously, if a guy is really high owned, goes out and has a great performance, you're going to absolutely have to have them. So you're going to hear ownership a lot. Ownership is going to be a big topic on this channel when it comes to strategy. There's a lot of game theory involved with DFS. Making sure you play some of the sneakier guys can always be a plus EV situation. I don't want to get into too much here, but you're going to hear ownership a lot, and we're talking about how much a player is played. Going on with ownership, let's talk about chalk. So a chalk player is somebody who's extremely high owned. Sometimes you hear of people quote unquote eating the chalk. That would be playing the really high owned player. And the reason why it has that negative connotation of eating the chalk, obviously no one wants to eat chalk in real life, is because it's a little bit ugly, right? You don't like having to do it. Again, if a guy ends up playing really well, ends up being a really high-owned player, you still have to beat a ton of your competition to take down that contest. On the contrast, if you play somebody that's owned in only 1% of lineups and he goes out and has a great day, you're sitting pretty. You know, only 1% of the competition also has that player. So that's what chalk is, somebody that's super high-owned. A fade is somebody that you're not playing in DFS. So a lot of times when a player's chalk, he's not really projecting that well for you. You want to fade that player. So you're going to hear fade a lot. When somebody's fading a player, they don't like them that week, and typically they're a higher owned player. Leverage, let's start with a sleeper. So a sleeper would be the opposite of a fade. So somebody is a sleeper would be a low-owned player that projects well, and somebody that you can get leverage on. So leverage is another term you're going to hear thrown out a lot. A lot of times people don't explain themselves when they use the word leverage, but leverage means getting more of a player or a play than the rest of your competition. So let's say somebody's expected to be owned in 12% of lineups. Playing somebody 30 or 40% of the time in your lineups means you have leverage on the field. If you were to have matched the field with 12%, you would have no leverage. If the player goes out and has a great day, you aren't gaining anything over your competition. Even if you played 18% of that player and there were 12% owned was what he was globally, you still don't have leverage on that player. There's rake involved with the DFS contest, and you're hardly gaining an edge over your competition. So when somebody talks about getting leverage on the field, they're talking about playing somebody a lot more than everyone else to make sure that it makes a difference when they play well. And you're also going to hear a lot about optimizers. Optimizers are a way to create lineups. So an optimizer takes in a quantitative value. That can either be a projection, their ceiling, their floor. You can optimize on ownership projection just to get the lowest owned guys in a lineup. You can optimize on anything. Again, the whole point of it is to maximize whatever score you're looking for at the staying under the price cap. So you have the $50,000 on whatever site that you're on, Draftkings or FanDuel. What's the best lineup you can get for that $50,000? There's a lot of computer programming with that, something that I have experience with from college. But when somebody talks about an optimizer, that's what they're talking about. Custom modeling is a little bit different. So a lot of people mix these two up. So a custom model is a way to assign values to a player. So like I said before, you can optimize on any value. It can be a projection, a ceiling, or floor. A lot of people will optimize based on a custom model, especially for golf DFS. So for me specifically, I do a lot of golf DFS. It's where I spend most of my time in terms of this field. And for me, I do a lot of custom modeling. My goal with that is to take into mind the way that a golf course plays and a way that a player's played over a season. Essentially what you want to do is marry up the skill set that'll best take on that golf course with the skill set of the player that you're looking for. So a player that has that skill set is going to get a boost in terms of that custom modeling. Somebody that doesn't necessarily fit that mold is going to get a little bit negative bump. So that's what I mean by custom modeling. It's a way to assign that value. There's no specific method to it. Everyone has their own ways of doing it, but that's a specialty of mine. I'm an electrical engineer by trade. I have a lot of numerical analysis techniques, a lot of coding experience as well. So when you hear me talk about custom modeling, it's a way that I characterize my players, identify the best players, and assign a concrete value to that. Coming down to visualization, so that would be the next step after custom modeling or after optimizing. Visualization is how you actually see that data. It's a way of taking that data, putting it on a chart, color coding it, whatever you want to do to make it easily readable. Visualizations are what I give out to my subscribers. It's what I post on my Patreon. It's how I make the data easy to read and make it usable for you in DFS. So a visualization is essentially a chart or a graph. It's a way of visualizing, again, hence the name, the data you're looking at. Now we'll go into a few of the other, let's say, terms that you'll hear here and there. Let's talk about a stars and scrubs lineup. Again, a little bit more niche, we'll say, but a stars and scrubs lineup is when you pay up for 3 or 4 of the really high-owned guys and then pay for 3 of the guys that are priced way down on the board. Essentially, you have 3 stars in your lineup and 3 scrubs. You'll hear that thrown out here all the time, so just wanted to get that out there. Let's talk about a flyer pick. You're here flyer all the time. Like, I'll take a flyer on this player. What it means is that you're going to use him in maybe 1 or 2 lineups. He doesn't project well this week, but nobody's using him. Perhaps he has a ton of potential, that kind of thing. So you're taking a flyer on him. It's like buying a lottery ticket. You don't expect to win, but again, it has really high upside. What we're going to do now is talk about some of the basic strategies that people implement in DFS. Pretty much everyone that plays uses these, people that at least have a few months of experience in the field, and you hear a lot of touts talk about them as well. In terms of ownership, there's fades and leverage plays. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times there will be chalky players, people that are being owned by a ton of people, and a lot of the time you want to fade those players. Again, even if they end up having a great weekend, you're going to have to go out and compete with everyone else that has that player. And on the other end, you have leverage plays, people that aren't being owned as much, that you get well over the field in terms of ownership. So ownership's a huge deal when it comes to strategy. We're going to have a whole video on that coming out next week. But in terms of ownership, high ownership's bad, low ownership's good. In terms of correlation, so correlation is something that I use with a lot of my modeling, especially with my optimizations. And that's when you try to group people with similar skill sets, especially with golf. You may group people from the same game in a football game if you assume it's going to be a high scoring affair. Or you might even choose people in basketball that are playing against each other. Again, for the same reason, higher pace game, higher scoring games tend to draw up the fantasy scores from both sides. You also have the fact that a lot of times when there's a high volume affair, especially for an NBA game, and there's more shots being made, let's say one side's taking a ton of shots, and they're making their fair share, but they're missing a lot of shots as well. That means the other team has a lot more rebound opportunities. So correlation pretty much can be used in any type of DFS. In golf, you're correlating skill sets. In the NBA, you can be using correlations, stacking games. In the NFL, you can do the same thing as well. So different ways to use correlation, but you're going to hear that a lot in the industry. Essentially, that's matching up players that when they play well, other players should be pulled along as well. Leaving salary on the table is also something that a lot of people do in DFS. So you're allotted $50,000 worth of salary, but there's no rule that you actually have to spend all $50,000. When we take a look at most lineups put into DFS, 98.7% of lineups use all $50,000. If you go and just use $49,800, just leave $200 on the table, which is essentially nothing when it comes to DFS, you'll be just one of 0.1% of lineups. So a lot of times when you're looking to differentiate your lineup, make sure that you're not duplicated with other people. People will leave salary on the table. When you're looking at golf, this is a little bit golf specific. We'll talk about tee time stacking. So obviously weather is a huge factor in golf. If you've ever played golf before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So a strategy a lot of people use in golf DFS is stacking tee times, using players that all tee off in the morning, hoping that in the afternoon that the wind kicks up, or vice versa. So another strategy that people implement. Just wanted to give you a different idea of the variety of strategies that are used across the industry. We can talk about lineup stacks in baseball. In baseball DFS, it's a positionality type of DFS. You get to pick a certain first baseman, second baseman, outfielders, catchers, etc. A lot of people in baseball DFS will take players from the same team. Players that are batting second, third, fourth, and fifth. They'll draft all those guys in the same lineup in hopes that a couple of them get singles and the guys further down the board driving them in with home runs, doubles, and etc. So you get points for scoring runs, you get points for getting hits in baseball, for RBIs, and when you can cluster people together and score big with a big home run or something like that, that's when you really score a lot of points in baseball DFS. So that's why you'll see lineup stacks there. You'll also see those in basketball for the same reasons I mentioned before. A lot of times when there's a high scoring affair, when there's a high volume affair, the guys on the other side are being pulled along as well. Leaving room for late swaps in basketball. Now, this is a little bit more complex, something that we're going to cover down the line, perhaps in a couple months. But in basketball DFS, we have something called late swap. That's where you're able to change players after a lock has already happened. Essentially, if a guy gets injured, a lineup changes before lock, as long as the game has already not started, you can take that guy out and replace him with somebody who also hasn't started. In basketball, there's often 3 or 4 games that are happening late into the night, 10, 11 o'clock at night. And it's usually a good idea to make sure that you leave some guys in those games because a lot can happen before then. You have guys that are rested for injury, people that aren't playing due to injury. You have people that will be rested randomly, especially Kawhi Leonard for the Clippers last year. And making sure that you have room to adjust your lineups can be huge. You can get a lot of leverage on the field. You can end up finding plays that nobody's able to use because they used guys in the first set of games. So a lot of people will leave room for late swaps in basketball. And that's just another example of a DFS strategy you'll hear of in the industry. The next thing I want to cover is bankroll management. So when I talk about bankroll management, I talk about considering the money that you want to put into DFS, making sure you don't run through it too fast, making sure you're consistently adding to that number rather than losing money. And it's something that a lot of people in DFS don't pay attention to, and it really hurts them. A lot of it comes down to contest selection. You really only want to play a percentage of your bankroll at any time. You should never really have $0 on Draftkings, because even if you lose a lot of money in a certain week, again, it should only be a percentage of the money that you're playing. And next week, you should be lowering the amount of money you put in. It should always be proportional. For me, I usually play about 30% of my current DK bankroll. Again, if I'm winning money week to week, I'm going to be playing even more than next week. If I lose money, I'm scaling that back. The whole point with that is to make sure that you're not being overly aggressive in DFS, and also make sure that you're staying responsible as well. And when you start off, you should only be playing a few dollars in DFS at the very most. I recommend that you start with single entry contests. Again, that's a way to stay away from a lot of the sharks, people that do this full time. It also lets you focus on just one lineup at a time. Again, if you're new to DFS, you don't really have a lot of experience, you haven't had success so far, you don't want to be trying to juggle 150 different lineups. That's a complete case for disaster. Focusing on one single lineup, really making sure that it's a solid lineup is the way to go. Obviously, over time, when you gain that experience, get even more familiar with how DFS works. You can start experimenting with 2, 3 entry, even 20 entry, and then work your way up to putting in 150 different lineups. Also with Bankroll Management, you have to have the mindset of a cash game versus a GPP. In GPPs, you're going to lose money more than most of the time. You're going to lose money about 60, even 70% of the time if you're playing right. The whole point of that is it's a volatile, most of the money to first type of format, and unless you're finishing in that top 5 or even first place, you're not really finding those returns. And often to find first place, to finish in that top 5, you have to make very risky, very aggressive plays as well. So not only do you have to keep in mind in GPPs that you're going to often lose money, you have to keep in mind that you have to split your games up, right? You can't play all GPPs. If you are, you just have to understand that you're playing a lottery ticket, that you're usually going to lose money week to week. If you're looking to consistently build on your bankroll, if you're looking to round it out, perhaps make it a little bit more consistent, then you got to play some cash games. Again, they're not as flashy. You're not going to win $1 million in a cash game. Hell, you're not even going to win $1,000 in a cash game unless you're putting in huge entry fees. But again, you're looking at a much more consistent return. And what I usually do is I play a good amount of cash games, about 40-50% of my bankroll every week on cash games. And then I play the other 10-20% I'm playing on my GPPs. Again, it's usually a 3-to-1 ratio. If I'm playing 30% of my bankroll in a week, it would be like a 20-10 split. The reason for that, again, is the cash games are really where you're making most of your returns, and GPPs really should be for entertainment, right? If you're counting on GPPs to give you return to win week in and week out, you're not playing DFS correctly. The next step up for a lot of people in DFS is going to be modeling. Making your own models goes a long way. You're going to have a lot of people that try to give you models, try to show you what their models are doing. And while that can be great, there's a lot of great talent out there, myself included. I think I make some good models. Doing it yourself is by far the most beneficial. So not only are you getting customized data, you're getting data that's going to differentiate yourself from a lot of other people. You also really get a grasp and understanding of the data that you're reading. When you get data from other people, again, it'll show you who's the quote unquote best, but you don't always understand why. When you're able to make your own models, when you're able to go out and do your own analysis, not only do you get, again, very customized data, you get a lot of understanding, and there's a lot of importance with that as well. When you're making lineups, you're not always just trying to put in the highest projected players. You're trying to consider situations where one team is at very high volume and it potentially brings up another player. There's a lot of dynamics when it comes to DFS. And with every sport, the dynamics are different, and the more and more you play, the more and more you're going to understand that. And by modeling yourself, again, you get a better grasp on that, and you don't have to be very complex with it, right? Modeling can be as simple as just generating numbers together in an algebraic equation, right? You can do it linearly. You can just take a player's, let's say, driving distance, assign it a number, add it to their shots gained number in each category, and get a custom model number. Now, that would be very archaic. Wouldn't really consider the golf course or anything like that. You could still make your own custom model in 5 minutes very easily. Again, you would want to work on making that more accurate, more mindful, but you get the idea. Custom modeling doesn't have to be super complex. It can be. Again, the better numerical techniques you use, the more accurate they can be. but it doesn't have to be rocket science, especially at first. And your goal with your modeling is really to do all of the thinking beforehand. Your goal is to act rather than react. A lot of times there's going to be injuries that come up. There's going to be differences in weather patterns, a lot of factors that come up last second that can really throw you off. And unless you have your modeling done beforehand, actually, I should say, if you have your modeling done beforehand, it's really no sweat, right? You just take a look at your modeling, you make a few adjustments with your calculations, and you move forward. It really does all of the thinking for you. So that's the magic of doing custom modeling. It saves you time. Sure, you got to put in some work in the, beforehand before you end up reaping the benefits, but it ends up being worth it in the long run. And again, with modeling, the goal is to assign a value so you can congregate those numbers together and get in a feel for how a player is going to play. Again, there's no rocket science to it. People have different methods for doing so, but I figured I'd mention it since you're going to hear it a lot in the industry. That's all I've got for my daily fantasy sports 101. Again, this is the first video in a series that I'll be starting on my channel where I start going into daily fantasy sports strategy weekly. Next week, we're going to be talking about how I won $150,000 playing Draftkings NBA. We're going to be going through my $100,000 GPP lineup as well as my $50,000 third place lineup. Both of them look very different. I used very different strategies to win each GPP. One of them was 6 months ago. One of them was over a year and a half ago. So you get to see kind of how I morphed as a DFS player, how some of my strategies maybe changed from contest to contest, and how each strategy helped me take that down. So that'll be the next video in the series. As always, though, if you guys enjoyed the content, please make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out with growing the channel, and again, I really appreciate that. Also, if you guys subscribe, you guys can catch all my specific content I do for DFS. I do specific breakdowns for every PGA Tour tournament. I'm also starting a lot of content for the NFL season. We're going to be covering every week's slate. I also have my positional rankings for season-long fantasy football up there. When the NBA season comes back around, obviously going to be doing content for that, and always doing MMA content as well. Anytime there's a UFC card, you will catch my top 6 picks on my channel. So again, subscribe so you can catch all that content I'm posting daily. And I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you guys next time.